Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Bob the Booker, and today you may notice that the lighting situation is a little bit different and that the bags under my eyes are looking significantly stronger because of said lighting. That is because I'm just recording at night. It's been a bit of a day at work. Gonna do some recording now and get this sort of video out to everybody, but all in a good cause, because this is to celebrate the wonderful birthday of the birthday of the wonderful Iris Murdoch, the author and winner of the Booker Prize. You were wondering when that was going to get mentioned. But it's worth noting Iris Murdoch holds the record for the most nominations, twinned with Margaret Atwood, for the most nominations ever, well, for most shortlists ever for the Booker Prize at 6, which is kind of staggering when you think about it. For 6 separate years, you know, 6 of your books were deemed to be in the top 6. Admittedly, Iris Murdoch in theory has a slight advantage because her books were kind of coming out at a period where, you know, it was open to fewer writers, but at the same time, I think her books are extraordinary and deserve to have been there anyway. So let's have a little look. So Iris Murdoch was shortlisted for the first ever Booker Prize way back in 1969 with her book The Nice and the Good. And I think what I find really special about Iris Murdoch, and partly a reason I wanted to sort of talk about her, apart from everything to do with the Booker Prize, is just that I find her an utterly fascinating writer and character. There is a wonderful biography written of her by John Bayley, her husband. And it's written, the first volume at least is written just as Iris Murdoch was really struggling with her memory. She'd sort of just been diagnosed with Alzheimer's and was slowly sort of withdrawing into herself. And it's really tragic and really, really sad, but I just think this is such a beautifully written biography. And he talks about the woman behind these books. And, you know, he obviously knew her very well as her husband. And Iris just had this extraordinary life where kind of led to sort of see her as this really super sharp intellectual who kind of cuts through everything, is able to kind of almost do anything that she turns her hand to. So we get this description of her learning how to cook. Oh, not even learning how to cook, sorry, just cooking this extravagant meal for the first time and absolutely nailing it. And everyone around being like, of course, it's Iris doing what she does again, being brilliant. Iris was a British and Irish woman, sort of Irish family, brought up in the UK, and met John Bayley at Cambridge University. Was it Oxford? Yeah, met at university. And her sharp, at Oxford, sorry, yeah. Her sharp intellect was sort of noticeable right from the beginning, but in a really understated way. She would just turn up, know the answer for something, and then not really even expect applause or anything. She would just do it and just be generally really quite clever. And that is probably borne out and shown in the fact that not only was she a writer of 20-something novels, she also wrote plays and philosophy and poetry and nailed all of it, seemingly. And the philosophical element is something really important because that gets threaded into a lot of her work, and I'll be talking a bit about that with some of these Iris books here. But John Bayley talks about this gorgeous moment where his wife, Iris, sort of asks him a question about whether he's ever considered writing, and he sort of says, oh yeah, you know, maybe, how about you? And she's like, oh yeah, well, I've written a novel actually. And then it, you know, she sort of seems very coy and sort of shy about it, and within a few months the book's being published. It's just sort of one of those moments that was sort of quite instrumental to kind of really understanding a bit about who Iris was. And that first novel, Under the Net, was published way back in 1954, and she had a writing career that took her right up to her final novel, Jackson's Dilemma, in 1995. So, you know, a good sort of 40-year writing career alongside everything else she was doing, which is kind of incredible. But that takes us to the first Booker Prize shortlist for her in 1969. And in some ways it feels quite fitting that the first ever Booker Prize has an Iris Murdoch shortlisting going on, because Iris would then obviously come to be in the prize another 5 times. But what I think is especially great about this is that first book of hers to be shortlisted, The Nice and the Good, is this really quite beautiful story of a group of characters who are often quite terrible, and in many ways it sets the tone for a lot of other Iris books, where you've got kind of characters kind of constantly competing with each other, characters who are both sort of wonderfully awful in many, many ways. A lot of them are deeply flawed people, but ultimately we're meant to love them. There is, of course, an obligatory gay male character who just turns up because Iris Murdoch seemed to not be able to write a single book without a random gay man appearing, often as one of like the standout great characters. Something I really appreciate in Iris's books. Herself being a bisexual woman, that there was always this kind of queer representation and always a kind of possibility of it. We often had slight references to potential queer characters or potential queer relationships within the books. And something that I really just adored. So she released in 1968, she released The Nice and the Good, and it was shortlisted in 1969. And this story really starts to investigate the idea of what it means to be good, what it means to be bad. We have these sort of stories of characters who, over long periods of time, over kind of a criminal investigation, let's say, are trying to kind of work out who's really been good or bad all along. The book starts with a suicide, and we learn through many characters, too many for me to keep hold of, I'm not very good at this, but quite a lot of characters. We get this really interesting description of all of these characters sort of realizing their own part in various sort of escapades. So the detectives are trying to track things down, but in the meantime you've got blackmail, you've got blackmailers being blackmailed, you've got the spouses of blackmailers being kind of in on it but also not in on it, you've got many people sort of cheating, and that's kind of part of the blackmail, you know, that there's one character who has sort of multiple lovers, and that's sort of revealed and sort of made, you know, it's made to come to light. But in the process we start to think, actually some of these characters aren't, they're being blackmailed, but are they actually truly are they the victim, or are they kind of complicit in some kind of crime? And I think that's what's really interesting about this book. It's full of that kind of Iris Murdoch wit. It's very sharp and silly and absurd. There are sort of some scenes where characters are sort of just running around between various lovers, and it's farcical and hilarious, and I love it. This is the kind of book that I think Iris seems to write quite a lot of from the six I've read of hers. Yeah, and I absolutely love it. And it was really interesting because then a year later, there she is being shortlisted again in the 1970 Booker Prize with Bruno's Dream. And this is a similarly absurd sort of family drama of this man Bruno, as he's sort of in and out of sort of various sort of weird dreams and sort of sleeping patterns, and he keeps on referring back to this book of spiders, and there are loads of references to spiders throughout the book, and it's really quite silly in many ways. And in the process you've got these other characters sort of around him and sort of part of this family, really trying to work out where they sit, what's going to happen if anything happens to Bruno. There's one man who is mourning his ex, who sadly died, and then in the process he's sort of with another woman, but he's also then he doesn't really know how to function, and then it's just sort of, again, I mean, I think essentially an underlying message in a lot of Iris's books seem to be men are just a bit silly and ridiculous, really, which, you know, fair, but I think the great thing about it is Iris just introduces these characters who are so ridiculous. You know, they are absurd, but actually we always feel something for them. No character ever really feels completely written off. And I think that's something that's so warm and generous about her writing. Bruno's Dream, I think, does this in a really funny way, with just ridiculous scenes of characters misunderstanding each other, sort of yelling at each other about random things and never quite getting there. And in the meantime, this family's sort of breaking down, and there's this whole fight around a rare stamp, that's sort of triangular stamp that's worth a good deal of money. Someone wants to steal it to trade it in for a camera. That sort of eventually comes to light and is a problem, but at the same time there's then a flood that sort of threatens to destroy everything, and we're kind of left with that absurdity of characters who never really wanted to spend any time with each other being forced to spend time with each other and hating every single moment of it. And it's brilliant for that because it's so silly and absurd. Iris purposely kind of almost, it feels almost like at first that she's being incredibly cruel to her characters. She puts them through so much, and John Bayley himself even kind of jokes about this a little bit in the biography of Iris. And but actually what seems at first to be really cruel about what he's doing is actually incredibly, what she is doing is incredibly generous, actually, because she creates the environments where these characters can live out ideas and really engage with them. And it's something about that writing process that is so beautiful, and something that I just really enjoy about Iris's work. There's a gorgeous moment in Paul Bayley's biography where he talks about, he references writers like Pushkin and Tolstoy, and he talks about how that those kind of writers, when they spoke about what they did, they often sort of spoke almost with a sense of surprise about this idea of freedom within a novel. And actually, what's so interesting is that those authors really kind of saw their role in kind of a way of, they created an environment for characters to then go and live in. And apparently Iris found this both sort of really fascinating, but also sort of occasionally wanted to challenge it, of yes, she creates this world and the characters kind of do what they want, but her characters were often vessels for ideas as much as they were anything else. As I sort of mentioned, you know, her work often involved lots of philosophical elements, and that's exactly what she brought in. And her next shortlisted book, The Black Prince, does that incredibly well. I've spoken a bit about The Black Prince in a few other videos, and I just adore it. I just think this is an absolutely classic, brilliant piece of literature. It was shortlisted in 1973. It also won the James Tate Black Memorial Prize that year, which is another literary award, a really interesting one actually. And The Black Prince is all about this idea of, it's essentially is a bit of a kind of farce again. It's a sort of comedy drama almost of, we are presented the book at the very beginning with an editor's note letting us know that there was an incident, and indeed we are finding out more about it, and through the notes of characters. What actually then transpires is we start realizing, perhaps through the book, that there's something kind of unreliable going on there, that actually this editor, who's sort of claiming to be a friend of the man in prison, may well be the man in prison writing his, it's sort of something to try and exculpate him from all of his wrongs. And it's so brilliantly done. It's about 400 pages long, and I read it pretty much in one night. I was just fully invested in this novel. I loved it. And I think what it does that's so funny is it just keeps ramping up the pressure in this story of this man who, he, at the beginning we are told he sort of claims that he witnesses a crime and then doesn't really know what to do, so he sort of runs away. Later on, other characters seem to tell us that maybe he was involved in the crime. We have the typical gay man appearing in this story again, Iris ticking that one off the list. And in this one, the gay male character is ridiculously head over heels in love with this pretty abhorrent main character and sort of narrator who we're not meant to trust, and we just get a bit of a sense of him being a bit horrible. I mean, that same narrator, he also dates a woman who's underage, who is the daughter of a rival novelist who he's never quite been able to get over, because he, you know, our narrator is a bit of a failed writer, whereas this other man he sort of sees as having had a successful career that he never did, and it's sort of unfair. And his wife starts going off with this other fancier novelist, or seems to be kind of turning against him. And so we get this moment at the end of the book where it's sort of this court showdown scene almost, of every other character being like, actually, no, wait, let me tell you my side of the story. This man is an idiot. And the gay man who is in love with him completely exonerates him from everything. And he's like, no, he didn't do any of that. And even if he did, he's only doing it because he's in love. And it's one of those things I can so see if this was a writer other than Iris Murdoch, and if it was written just a little bit differently, I would find this a real caricature and find it really offensive as a gay man. But I think what actually makes this completely work for me is every character in this book is so absurd, and so this character's kind of infatuation with the narrator makes sense alongside everyone else. It's not seen as a character flaw as such. It's just sort of seen that everyone is sort of delusionally in love with this narrator, or if they're not in love with him, they have had some kind of relationship where they're now running a million miles away from him. And so there's an intensity to all of the relationships that I just found hilarious throughout the book. It's so brilliant. And I think what is so great about this book is just that it keeps that level of humor and silliness all the way through, but then really makes a strong sort of philosophical kind of point, or really brings something out in the end about what kind of story we trust, what stories we tell ourselves to kind of convince ourselves that things are okay. And ultimately, I think that's what's so brilliant about this book. We get to the end and we just are sort of meant to think, we don't really know what's happened here. We can kind of, you know, all of these stories seemingly will corroborate someone else's story and discount somebody else's story. And in doing so, it's just brilliant. It's so funny because you don't really know what to believe, and it kind of doesn't matter. And then we get this final editor's note that's really meant to sort of throw the cat among the pigeons and make no sense again, to kind of really leave us guessing. And I think what I appreciate about this book is just that it is just so able to capture that voice all the way through. It's amazing for about 400 pages that pace never really seems to leave. And I really felt it so vividly when I was reading this book, and why I sort of read it pretty much in one go. It's interesting as well because this was Iris's third nomination. I keep on saying Iris like we're besties, but this was Iris Murdoch's third nomination, and she almost won for this. Interestingly, there was sort of, I mean, I say interestingly, this is literally interesting to just me, but Iris Murdoch was shortlisted. There were only 4 books shortlisted for that shortlist. Shortlisted for that shortlist, you know what I mean? And apparently, basically, the winner was chosen, and then pretty much overnight, one of the other people who'd been kind of chosen the winner actually said, oh, you know what, I think it probably should be Iris. I think it should be Iris's book. But by then it was too late, and so we didn't get Iris as a winner then. So in my mind, I like to count this as basically being her win as well. But I mean, a gorgeous book, so funny. And I just was, for me, the first Iris book I read where I was just like, oh, okay, I see what she's doing and I love it. I was fully sold on it after this. Iris Murdoch would have to wait another 5 years to be shortlisted again, but when she did, she won. So there we go. This book is The Sea, and I have spent a lot of time talking about how much I love this book. I listened to it as an audiobook as well, which really helped. It was read by Richard E. Grant, who is brilliant, and I think perfectly captures the kind of caddish tone at the heart of this. We are presented with a really unlikable main character, Charles Araby, and he is a sort of slightly washed up actor who kind of goes around giving his views on everything, and he's especially very opinionated about food, and he's kind of constantly trying to make out that he's got this great taste. And we meet all of his ex-lovers who all pretty much hate him. Everyone sort of there's a really great video about this on Kieran KD Books channel, where he talks about this really brilliantly and describes it as sort of a literary sort of Love Island, or sort of X on the Beach, which is very much what it feels like, because Iris just keeps on ramping up the sort of absurdity with these frankly ridiculous relationships. You've got these women who have previously dated Charles Araby, who all hate him, who all think he's a bit rubbish, apart from one who's still a little bit in love with him. There is also our customary gay man. Well, it's kind of, I don't think it's ever sort of said that he's actually gay, but he's sort of presented as this very fey, camp theatrical type who, I mean, the audiobook is brilliant for capturing this voice. And what I found really interesting is Kieran at KD Books, when we were sort of chatting about this book, I sort of imitated what Richard E. Grant did for the voice on this audiobook, and it was exactly the voice that Kieran had heard when he was reading it as a physical book, which I think is sort of testament to how brilliantly captured this voice is. But we introduced this really ridiculous man who's sort of like, Charles, yes, darling, I love it, about everything. And so he would sort of talk and be like, well, I don't really know. It's frankly ridiculous. I love him. It's brilliant. It's so well done. And he's sort of our comic foil to the main character. I mean, the main character is also absurd and we're not meant to like him, so it's kind of funny in that respect anyway. But we are presented with all these relationships, all of these women have been sort of somewhat burned by him. And something I said when I was sort of you know, gushing about how much I love this book before, is this book is about 600 pages long. At about 300 pages, we end book 1 and go into book 2. They could stand alone as novels, because book 1, you get to the end of it, and my goodness, there is a lot. Well, it could have ended on that kind of cliffhanger of this sort of potential death and this sort of moment, and you're like, what is happening? The next 300 pages, Iris just sort of almost punishes these characters. It just keeps on going, and it should be miserable and it should be unbearable, but something carries you through the book. Probably just that humor and absurdity and voice that's throughout the whole thing. And I think this is when I sort of completely knew that I loved her. After, you know, The Black Prince and after The Sea, I knew that this is an author I would cherish and love, even just if it was just these 2 books, because they're so funny, but they pack a punch, and I think it's a really brilliantly done book, and it just keeps on going for that gold and keeps on pushing harder and harder. This is, I think, so far from probably, I think I've read about half of all the Booker Prize winners that we've had. I think this has to be up there with my favourites. I don't think I've read anything like it. I adore this book, and I am so glad that Iris Murdoch got that kind of recognition for this book, even though she should have also got it for The Black Prince, but that's a different discussion. But yeah, gorgeous, gorgeous book, and it makes me so happy. And Iris would have to wait a little while again for her next shortlist. So in 1985, she gets her 5th shortlist, shortlisting rather, with The Good Apprentice, which is a kind of, again, a ridiculous, absurd story. Again, all of the characters, especially the men, are awful. But essentially what happens is a character right at the beginning, we're sort of told, has tricked a friend by giving them by giving their friend a hallucinogenic drug in a sandwich, and as a result this person gets kind of high and falls out and of a window and dies. Again, kind of almost sort of taking from the Roald Dahl school of humour, of just like, make something as dark as possible, and then whilst you're down there, find some humour in it. And essentially that's what happens throughout the book. This character who's given the drugs is so full of guilt and really can't deal with himself, but in the process some really funny bits happen around them. There are some sort of silly things. There's a character, again, this is a very Iris Murdoch trait. There's a character who sort of over-intellectualizes life and goes on to live this pure life and go and, like, kind of, I want to be an aesthete, I want to go and do this and be away from the world. And Iris Murdoch is always seemingly a fan of creating those characters to kind of lampoon them and be like, frankly, this is a bit ridiculous, but also let's explore the ideas. Why would someone want to do that? And we get this kind of, again, there's a gay male character, but we get this these sort of rotating characters sort of in and out of each other's lives who really cannot find a way to live and be happy and sort of make everything work, and eventually they sort of do. But it's brilliant watching, you know, over quite a long book, it's about 500 pages or so, watching these characters sort of go in and out of really quite difficult emotions, trying to process everything that's happened. But actually, ultimately, this book is quite hopeful. We kind of get this end in some ways of, you know, can you ever recover from something? Can you ever be forgiven? It's a really, really interesting book. And I think it was maybe the first of hers I actually ever read. And I was like, okay, I was sort of warming up. This isn't my favourite of hers, but I still think it was really, really good. Also, this is something that I love about this with Iris, because she just published so many books so quickly. We get this ridiculous moment of this sort of part of, you know, the Wikipedia entries for any of these books when I was sort of refreshing my memory to remember what actually happens in the book. The Good Apprentice is the 22nd novel by Iris Murdoch. Can you imagine 20? I mean, this wasn't even her last book, as we'll see. So just, I love that Iris Murdoch was just churning out these books of great quality so often. And it's interesting because that actually counted against her in the earlier prize. So in 1969 and 1970, she was obviously, you know, shortlisted back to back, and the first person to do so that did to kind of get that it hasn't happened really often at all. I think Muriel Spark's the only other person, and it's interesting because she that Dame Rebecca West, the kind of one of the judges, was the only judge to be there in both 69 and 70, and she was apparently quite domineering and, you know, would very much had strong opinions, and those strong opinions kind of overrode everybody else, to the extent that she made some kind of proclamation early on that Iris Murdoch publishes good and bad novels in alternate years. And she made a sort of sweeping judgment of, and this is one of the bad years. And that sort of stopped her from winning, and I believe 1969, which is kind of interesting to see how, you know, just one or two judges can really swing things, because she had a lot of influence in that room. But I think it sort of still is just so interesting to see just the power of Iris Murdoch's writing, as she just does some incredible things. And finally, her last shortlisted novel came just 2 years later, and that was a book whose name I have entirely forgotten, even though it's over there. The Book and the Brotherhood. And this is a book with a really interesting sort of main concept of this group of academics, or kind of students, who are all sort of vaguely sort of left-wing Marxist communists in some kind of form. There's a book that they have sort of created or are kind of involved in, and this book, it has sort of really strong pull, and in many ways gets many people into trouble, because it's seen as really out there, and there's this sort of scene of these characters sort of unpicking the book and sort of tearing it apart, and sort of saying, no, I don't want anything to do with it anymore. But it kind of follows these characters throughout their lives, and they can never really quite seem to be done with it, even over this sort of 600-page story. And what is really kind of fun about it, I mean, I struggled a bit more with this book, I'll admit. It's a bit denser. There are millions of characters, and I am terrible at that. Literally go above about 2 or 3 characters and I don't know who anyone is anymore, and I just need them to all wear like stickers being like, hi, my name is blah blah blah, you met me in chapter 2, I said that thing about this thing, I'm now going to go over here are some of my motivations. I need that. I'm not great at keeping track of more than a few. Anyway, and these characters all sort of try to distance themselves, and they go through various different parts of life trying to find different things to do that they can, to almost kind of exercise that part of their lives. But again, we kind of get this sort of campus-based, university-focused sort of novel, which is so interesting. You know, Iris Murdoch, again, was such an academic, and in so many ways, that this naturally keeps on coming up. There's this sort of ridiculous discussion at one point about whether this book is philosophy or if it's political, and this person's arguing, well, it's my own personal philosophy, and it takes a lot of learning from political science. And this person's sort of like, okay then, so is it political? And like, well, yes it is, but it's not a politics book, and it's not philosophy, it's all of these things. And it kind of is a really sort of fun little joke almost of Iris Murdoch kind of tearing apart these kind of fairly arbitrary distinctions between what make various sort of academic disciplines. Anyway, so all of that aside, we get this kind of really interesting book, and unfortunately that was her last time to be shortlisted. But you know, what a legacy to have had 6 whole books that were shortlisted for the Booker Prize. It's sort of telling that only another author like Margaret Atwood could kind of keep up with anything like that. And even, I mean, Margaret Atwood may go further. Ian McEwan is at 5, so Salman Rushdie, they may overtake, but we shall see. But I wanted to just bring us to something that I just found absolutely charming and heartbreaking and really powerful, which is the end of Iris Murdoch's life. So as I mentioned earlier, you know, her husband wrote this biography about her life as she sort of was nearing her final moments, and she's still alive pretty much when we're reading this book. And the final sort of chapter or part of this book is just a diary. And it takes place over a year, and we just sort of get these sort of fairly sporadic bits of inviting her to, you know, there's going to be a Christmas celebration, and John Bayley's trying to work out what that's going to look like with Iris Murdoch, and whether she's going to really be able to be part of it, whether it's worth bringing any guests along, whether that's going to be more traumatic for Iris. And her Alzheimer's is getting worse and worse, and we get this glorious, horrendously heartbreaking moment in this book. And I'll just read this little passage because I just think, I mean, apart from how beautifully written this whole book is, you know, a novelist and literary critic writing a biography of a novelist who's his wife, was probably bound to have some quite beautiful passages. But just this is absolutely lovely, and it really broke me. a bit. I just really had to sort of stop as I was reading this. Life is no longer bringing the pair of us closer and closer apart, in the poet's tenderly ambiguous words. Every day we move closer and closer together. We could not do otherwise. There is a certain comic irony, happily not darkly comic, that after more than 40 years of taking marriage for granted, marriage has decided it is tired of this and is taking a hand in the game. Purposefully, persistently, involuntarily, our marriage is now getting somewhere. It is giving us no choice, and I am glad of that. Every day we are physically closer, and Iris's little mouse cry, as I think of it, signifying loneliness in the next room, the wish to be back beside me, seems less and less forlorn, more simple, more natural. She is not sailing into the dark. The voyage is over, and under the dark escort of Alzheimer's, she has arrived somewhere. So have I. This new marriage has designed itself, as Darwin once speculated that fish perhaps designed their own eyes, to bring to an end her fearful anxieties of apartness, that happy apartness which marriage had once taken wholly for granted. This new marriage needs us absolutely, just as we need it. To that extent, it is still a question of taking for granted. And I just love this. It's just such a beautiful passage where we really get an insight into John Bayley's life living with Iris Murdoch, who is sort of no longer herself in some ways. We get these sort of passages where it's described, you know, she's standing there looking confused, or she can't really keep up with things, and he tries reading old Latin and Greek to her, and she sort of vaguely is there with it and sometimes isn't, and then a piece of music seems to bring her back. But I love that this end passage just really talks about how Iris is sort of shrinking and sort of feeling in some ways less and less like herself, but in John Bayley's mind, he hasn't lost her, not yet. If anything, it's sort of strengthening the marriage and showing what marriage really is, that they are sort of bound together in some way. And I just think it's beautiful. And it really touched me reading this part, just to think about what it must have been like. You know, there's been a fair bit of Alzheimer's in my family, and what it's like for the partners who were left with, you know, who were there in those kind of final moments. Feeling both quite lonely, but also kind of that they have a purpose, that, you know, their relationship has meant something. It's brought them to this moment of kind of a final farewell or a final piece of caregiving. And I just think it's so beautiful, especially after a book where you just get the sense of how much John Bayley loved his wife, how much he adored her, how much he was fascinated by this woman who was so uniquely herself, so powerful in her intellect. And there he is, sort of just cherishing these moments of togetherness, of the quietness of the end of her life. And it's just really touching and really beautiful. So on that somewhat somber note, I am really glad to have read these books by Iris Murdoch. I really urge you to go and check them out as well. She's got so many, so spin the wheel, pick one. Her final book as well, actually, interestingly, just didn't. Apparently, you know, there were inconsistencies that were just not like her, and some fans wrote in, and by that point Bayley was writing back himself. But he even saw that as quite a beautiful moment. He sort of keeps on seeing these moments of where she's maybe not quite herself, and he sees the alarm bells sort of ringing a bit sooner than Iris maybe does. And it's really brilliantly done. But really do check her out. Part of the reason for this coming out now is her birthday is on the 15th of July. And sort of just seems like a nice fitting way to cherish a writer who I think is just absolutely extraordinary and is nothing like anyone I've ever read before. So I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope you enjoy Iris Murdoch. Please let me know in comments any books of hers you've checked out. I've been Bob the Booker, talking about and babbling about Iris Murdoch. Take care and speak to you soon. Bye bye.